In the previous segment, we talked about the hierarchical nature of the organizational system of our bureaucracy. One important aspect that needs a little more deeper understanding is this hierarchical organization. The problem with the Indian state is that it is deeply centralized for a bureaucracy that is supposed to function in such a wide range vast landscape, where the issues in one part of the country are very divergent from the issues in the other, where the demands of one village are likely to be quite different to the demands of another. Yet the Indian state has created an architecture for itself where the process of financing, where the process of administration is deeply centralized. So when you talk about centralization, there are two or three about how states function. There's a fiscal aspect to it, there's an administrative aspect to it, there's a political aspect to it. And if you look at the architecture and organization of the Indian state, you will find that politically, India is quite deeply decentralized, even in terms of strong local government elections, strong regional parties, strong regional state level politics. Sometimes politics that takes place within a state has a huge influence on the center and vice versa. The politics of India is very decentralized, but our fiscal architecture and our administrative architecture is very, very centralized. Think about it, the Indian Administrative Service, that is the service that we all talk about the most, and the IAS is sort of central to our imagination. It's a central service. It might be broken up into state cadres, but it is essentially a central service. And the district magistrate or the district collector that run districts are part of the IAS architecture. They follow a deeply centralized system. The implementation is handled by the state cadres and local level bureaucrats that come on board sometimes as contract staff. They are all accountable in a very, very top-down manner in this very top-down hierarchical architecture. When you look at the education story in particular, this hierarchy is extremely visible. If you break down the functions of education and if you break down the actual distribution of powers and decision-making authority across the state, across the center, the state and the district, you will find, as we did when we did this activity map, that by and large the bulk of the activities that take place in order to deliver an education in a school in a village, the power and authority to take those decisions rests at best with the district and very little at the block, the school and the school management committee and the local government level. So it's in this hierarchical context that the role of the district and the role of the state become extremely central, which creates a kind of undermining of the ability of the frontline officers to take decisions. One reason why hierarchy is increasingly getting privileged in India is because the narrative of accountability has tended to privilege accounting, the ability to ensure that every action of yours is rule bound and that rule bound action can in fact be studied and determined over accountability, which is the consequences of your action. So as a result, the system has started functioning in a very legalistic, rule-bound way, and exercising discretion outside of those rules in order perhaps to get the job done becomes a much harder task than if one were to free the system to some degree from rules. I'll give you one example of how this plays out. I was very closely involved with the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program some years ago, and in a conversation with a government officer where we were arguing about the role of panchayats in the implementation of NREGA, which by law is meant to implement 50% of the total fund that comes into a district, the IAS officer said, "Excuse me, but I will not give my NREGA to those corrupt panchayats." And in order to ensure that the system is accounted for, very careful rules were articulated, leaving the panchayat with absolutely no flexibility to open a work, to define a shelf of work or anything in a manner that made sense for the panchayat. So that anomaly continues, and if you look in the education sector too, you'll find exactly the same thing. I recall once in Madhya Pradesh, the state project director, finance officer, showed me the rule book for expenditures are for the school management committee, where every detail, including how much the sweeper would be paid, was detailed out and handed over to the school management committee to implement. Accounting, not accountability. What the state should have been focusing on was whether the school is actually clean. What they chose to do instead was to tell the school how much they should hire the sweeper for, and surely the prices would vary depending on where you are and how it would look. And that also creates an organizational structure in which where trust becomes a huge liability. So our bureaucracy is a huge trust deficit. You talk to the top, they'll say the bottom doesn't work. You talk to the bottom, they say they can't work because the top imposes upon them, which affects the ability of the system to function, and which also creates this legitimized narrative of I'm just a post officer, what possibly can I do? So it is this curbing of discretion which ends up creating a structure where we're actually moving decision making in a manner that it actually responds to people's needs gets quite difficult. There have been some really important and interesting studies that have looked at these different kinds of bureaucratic cultures and what do they do for outcomes. One really important study was done by political scientist Akshay Mangla, who sort of created this distinction between a legalistic bureaucracy versus a deliberative bureaucracy. And in his understanding, that rule-based needing to do everything by the book in fact means that you don't get outcomes that are aligned with needs on the ground. Whereas bureaucracies that are able to be more deliberative, in that bureaucracies that are more consultative, that move away from the rules to start embedding themselves in different elements of society, parent-teacher associations, Mahila Mandals, civil society organizations, those bureaucracies are better able to be responsive, and it actually makes sense. So I actually think that the real challenge of administration in India is one of breaking away from this accounting as accountability structure, one that determines what level of function does what role and responsibility, what level of government should which role and responsibility or which function be assigned, in a manner that ensures that discretion at the appropriate level is enabled, and that mechanisms of deliberation are brought into how the bureaucracy functions. Akshay's work says that Himachal Pradesh was able to do this quite effectively, and we see the outcomes. In fact, on education parameters in India, Himachal Pradesh is a leader. But we need to really understand how you can create these deliberative mechanisms into bureaucracies that are by definition far more rule bound. And we also need to be able to determine, in this context of increased discretion, what are the mechanisms by which accountability and monitoring and therefore accountability is actually maintained. Because at no point am I suggesting that you have a complete sort of anarchic system where everybody is left to take decisions as they need to. There has to be this balancing out. It's not about pure decentralization, but it's about sensible decentralization, which creates a effective monitoring structure that monitors outcomes, but at the same time creates incentives within a system that ensures that rules are maintained where rules make sense and discretion is allowed where discretion makes sense. A useful way of thinking about it is in Landpritchett's very interesting work, where he makes these distinctions between transaction intensive activities and low transaction activities, a transaction and intensive activity and discretionary activities. A transaction intensive and a discretionary activity by necessity needs to be pushed down. A teacher is best placed to determine what level her students are in terms of their learning capability inside a classroom. The district education officer, the block education officer, for that matter perhaps even the headmaster, may not be the best place to determine that. A teacher meets and interacts with the student on a regular basis. Should the teacher be the one to determine the curriculum? Absolutely not. Standards have to be set at a higher level that are applicable across a range. Should a teacher be able to tweak her pedagogy in a way that aligns itself to the nature of the classroom? Absolutely, because only a teacher knows. Should the district education officer be monitoring whether the teacher is showing up? or should the headmaster and the parent-teacher association be monitoring whether a teacher is showing up? The headmaster and the parent-teacher, obviously, association, of course, because after all, they are closest to the school. They are the ones that should be able to impose that penalties on teachers that don't show up, because the district education officer is sitting somewhere very far away. When we empower the district to do transaction-intensive and discretionary tasks, what you end up with is rather odd things. We assume, for instance, that a biometric or an IVRS phone call will solve the problem. Of course it won't. You could always fudge it. You could always give an answer to a problem. The headmaster could always pick up the phone and say, of course I am in the school regardless of where you are. So that balancing out of where of what activities should be devolved at what level of government, where transaction intensivity and discretionary functions could provide a framework for that determination, I think is really important to create a bureaucratic architecture that ensures that it maintains that balance between accounting and accountability.